This is the season when all of nature seems to fold in on itself, coursing back into the earth from the place it sprang, seemingly out of nowhere, out of the bowels of the earth last spring, and now it all dissipates, it disappears before our eyes. And what more profound, purposeful way of celebrating this dissipation of nature than the harvest festival of Sukkot? As we all go out of doors at this time of year, when the moon has its full crest during the course of the month, 5 days after Yom Kippur, we venture out into these little fragile huts called Sukkot, and we relive, as it were, the exodus from Egypt, because we're told specifically in the 22nd chapter and bordering into the 23rd chapter of Vayikra, of Leviticus, that we're supposed to dwell in huts for a period of 7 days because God brought us out of Egypt in huts. And is this so? Well, not really. God didn't bring us out of Egypt in huts. God brought us out of Egypt, and we built the huts as lean-tos and permanent dwellings during the 40-year wanderings in the desert to protect ourselves from the elements. So what does the Torah mean when it says, Ki hoshavti, because I brought you out in Sukkot, when that does not seem to be the case? And this raises a lot of eyebrows and a lot of questions in the Talmud and the Midrash, elsewhere, amongst the rabbis throughout the sages, who question, how could the Torah possibly be wrong? And they ferret even deeper into the story of the exodus of Egypt, and what they come up with is not short of extraordinary. The Sukkot that are referred to in this book of Vayikra are not the Sukkot that we think of, these little lean-to huts that are open to the weather and open to the elements, but rather the Sukkot that are referred to by the Torah are the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory that accompanied us from the first moment that we stepped out of the Sea of Reeds and into the desert. These were our true protection. And according to legend, the clouds of glory not only provided our direction during the day, but they were cloud covering all throughout the day and the night, over our heads. And there were cloud covering in front, to the sides, and in the rear of us. And there's some that even say it was even beneath our feet. That the miraculousness of the deliverance from Egypt is almost outstripped by the miraculousness of that 40-year journey through the desert, being encompassed by these Ananei HaKavod that ensured our safety. Which brings the rabbis to another conversation and discussion about what was their purpose, why the necessity of the cloud surrounding us in all directions. You've probably heard many times in the past about how the Israelites showed themselves unworthy and unready to claim their independence in the land of Israel after having been freed from slavery. They weren't ready for it. They were still a slave mentality. But yet perhaps the argument even goes further than that. Perhaps the argument is really all about not only were they not ready, but they were so naive, so easily deceived and misled, that having brought them into the land of Israel after having been freed from slavery would have opened them to such vulnerable, luring thoughts and luring deeds by the local natives, by the Canaanites, that the Israelites would have slipped away. We would not be here today, in other words. That the Jews, having been enslaved for so many years and recently freed, would have just followed whatever pursuits that were in front of them. So the Ananei HaKavod were a protective shield over our people, making sure that for 40 years we developed enough ego strength, enough strength of character, enough strength and belief in God and belief in ourselves to be able to carry out our mission for all of these centuries and indeed millennia afterward. The Ananei HaKavod were the true miracle of the deliverance from Egypt, because they ultimately brought us to where we need to be. There's a wonderful passage from Rabbi Pinchas of Koretz, who makes a following observation about a particular prayer that we say during the Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, when we say, Harachaman, may the merciful one restore the fallen Sukkah of David. And what Rabbi Pinchas comments on this particular addition to the Birkat HaMazon is that when we take the brokenness and we see the brokenness of self, when we look around us and we realize the vulnerability with which we live even today, and we acknowledge it and we accept it, and then we crane our heads upward and we look toward God for direction and hope, God, as it were, raises the fallen Sukkah of David. That the symbolism of this Sukkah is the symbolism of our sojourn in the desert, our weakness to be prone to be pulled in any number of directions. But when we have faith, God does the rest. God secures and anchors the Sukkah and makes it a permanent place for us to find safety under his shelter wings for eternity. A beautiful rest of Sukkot and Shabbat Shalom.